You call yourself a mother? Judge Edmund Prescott's voice echoed through the fluorescent-lit courtroom as he peered down at Nadia Okafor from his bench, his black robes billowing like wings of judgment. Ghetto trash like you shouldn't be raising children anyway. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminated the tears on Nadia's face as she clutched her custody papers, her red blouse wrinkled from sleepless nights preparing her case. The bailiff smirked, the court reporter barely looked up, and the opposing attorney adjusted his tie with satisfaction. None of them noticed how Nadia's posture straightened slightly, or how her grip on those papers shifted from desperate to deliberate. Judge Prescott had just insulted the one person in the state with the power to end his career with a single phone call. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. The Riverside County Family Courthouse hummed with the sterile efficiency of institutional justice on this bright Tuesday morning. Fluorescent tubes cast their unforgiving light across worn wooden benches and faded carpet, while natural daylight flooded through the towering windows that lined the east wall. Nadia Okafor sat in the second row behind the petitioner's table, her black pants pressed despite the early hour, her red blouse chosen carefully to project stability and responsibility. She knew the psychology of first impressions in courtrooms, knew how judges formed opinions within seconds of seeing a face, reading a name, making assumptions about who deserved what kind of life. What Judge Edmund Prescott didn't know was that the woman sitting before him had spent 15 years mastering these very calculations. The bailiff, Reginald Bowers, stood near the side door with his arms crossed, his uniform pressed, and his expression bored. He'd seen countless custody hearings, watched countless families torn apart, and his face showed the weathered indifference of someone who'd stopped caring about individual suffering long ago. The morning light caught the badge on his chest as he shifted his weight, and Nadia noted how his eyes followed the judge's lead, how his slight smile emerged whenever Prescott's tone turned particularly harsh. She forced her hands to tremble as she stood when called. This was her moment to perform vulnerability, to embody everything the system expected from a single black mother fighting for her children. Her fictional backstory was memorized perfectly. Nadia Williams, age 34, 2 children ages 7 and 9, recently unemployed from a retail position, struggling with rent on a one-bedroom apartment in the city's most overlooked neighborhood. Judge Edmund Prescott reviewed her file with theatrical disdain, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through pages that supposedly contained her life's failures. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his robes immaculate, his entire presence designed to communicate the weight of institutional power. The fluorescent lighting created harsh shadows across his face as he looked up, and Nadia saw something predatory in his expression. "Miss Williams," he began, her fake surname rolling off his tongue like an accusation. "I've reviewed your employment history, your housing situation, and the reports from Child Protective Services." The opposing attorney, a thin man in an expensive navy suit, nodded approvingly from his table. His client, the children's fictional father, sat beside him with the satisfied air of someone who'd already been promised victory. Nadia had studied Judge Prescott's patterns for months through court records and case files. She knew he ruled against black mothers at a rate that defied statistical probability. She knew about the private foster care agencies that seemed to benefit from his decisions. She knew about the kickbacks, the fabricated reports, and the systematic destruction of families that looked like hers. But knowing and proving were different challenges entirely. "Your Honor," she said, letting her voice crack slightly, "I love my children. I've been working 2 jobs until the layoffs, and I'm actively searching for new employment. I have a stable home environment and strong community support." The words felt strange in her mouth after years of commanding courtrooms rather than pleading in them, but she delivered them with perfect authenticity. Judge Prescott's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Stable? You call a 1-bedroom apartment in the Riverside district stable? You call 2 months behind on rent stable?" His voice rose with each question, and Nadia saw heads turning in the gallery behind her. Community support. From what community? The same community that produces the highest crime rates in the county? The racist implications hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone but acknowledged by no one except the court reporter. whose typing seemed to slow deliberately. Nadia felt the familiar fire rising in her chest, the prosecutor's instinct to object, to cite precedent, to demand judicial conduct reviews. Instead, she let tears pool in her eyes and whispered, "I'm doing my best, Your Honor." In the gallery's third row, FBI agent Isaiah Carrington sat with a small recording device hidden in his jacket pocket. His muscular frame was concealed beneath a casual button-down shirt and khakis, his appearance carefully crafted to blend among the courthouse's usual visitors. He'd been documenting Prescott's hearings for 2 months, building a pattern of evidence that would soon become federal charges. His jaw tightened as the judge's language escalated, but his expression remained neutral. "Your best isn't good enough, Miss Williams." Judge Prescott leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried throughout the silent courtroom. "Children need structure, discipline, proper role models. They need to see success, not whatever example you're providing." His eyes swept over her appearance with obvious distaste. "Look at you, late to your own custody hearing, dressed like you're going to some kind of social event, rather than a court of law." Nadia had actually arrived 30 minutes early and spent the time in her car, reviewing her cover story and preparing mentally for this performance. Her red blouse was professional without being expensive, chosen specifically to avoid any accusations of either vanity or carelessness. But she understood that Judge Prescott wasn't really seeing her clothes or her punctuality. He was seeing her skin color and making assumptions that 20 years of legal education and professional achievement couldn't overcome. The opposing attorney stood smoothly. "Your Honor, my client has provided extensive documentation of Ms. Williams' inconsistencies regarding childcare, employment, and residential stability. We believe the children's best interests would be served by immediate placement in temporary foster care, while permanent custody arrangements are finalized with their father." Nadia's pulse quickened despite herself. Even knowing this was theater, even understanding that federal agents were recording every word, the prospect of losing fictional children to this corrupt system triggered every protective instinct she possessed. She thought about the real mothers who'd sat in this same chair, who'd faced this same judge without backup plans or federal protection, who'd watched their families disappear into a system designed to profit from their pain. "This is exactly what I expected," Judge Prescott announced, shuffling papers with performative authority. "Another case of someone who thinks having children is a right rather than a responsibility." The bailiff Reginald Bowers stepped forward slightly, anticipating the judge's next move. "Ms. Williams, your lifestyle choices and demonstrated inability to provide stable housing make it clear that these children require immediate intervention." The morning sunlight had shifted during the hearing, now illuminating dust motes dancing in the courtroom air like microscopic witnesses to injustice. Nadia calculated the federal charges accumulating with each bias statement: civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive constitutional protections, racketeering, if they could prove the financial connections. Judge Prescott was building his own indictment with every prejudiced word. But she also thought about the real children affected by this corruption, the real families torn apart by systematic racism disguised as judicial procedure. Her undercover investigation had already identified 47 cases where black children were removed under suspicious circumstances, where court reports contained identical language despite different social workers, where financial trails led to the same network of private agencies. Furthermore, Judge Prescott continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation, "I find it disturbing that Ms. Williams seems more concerned with her own rights than her children's welfare. This attitude of entitlement is precisely why these situations escalate to court intervention." He gestured broadly, encompassing not just Nadia, but somehow indicting her entire community. "We see this pattern repeatedly in this demographic." Agent Carrington's recording device captured every word, every inflection, every pause that revealed the judge's true motivations. The federal case was building in real time, but Nadia knew they needed more than recorded bias. They needed evidence of the financial corruption, documentation of the systematic targeting, proof of the conspiracy that connected judges to foster agencies to social workers in a web of profit built on destroyed families. The court reporter's fingers moved across her machine with mechanical precision, but Nadia noticed how certain phrases seemed to be abbreviated or modified. Another piece of the puzzle, another participant in the corruption network that extended far beyond one prejudiced judge. Therefore, Judge Prescott announced, raising his gavel with ceremonial gravity, "I hereby order immediate temporary custody be transferred to the father, with supervised visitation for Miss Williams pending completion of court-ordered parenting classes, psychological evaluation, and demonstration of stable employment and housing." The gavel fell with the sound of institutional finality. But Judge Edmund Prescott had just made the most expensive mistake of his career. In trying to silence what he saw as another troublesome black mother, he'd just declared war on the most powerful prosecutor in the state justice system. Nadia Okafor let the tears fall as she gathered her papers, playing her role to perfection while mentally preparing the federal charges that would soon transform this corrupt courthouse into the center of a national scandal. She stood slowly, her red blouse catching the fluorescent light as she walked toward the exit, knowing that Judge Prescott was watching her retreat with satisfaction. He had no idea he was watching the approach of his own reckoning. 3 months earlier, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the State Attorney General's office on the 32nd floor of the federal building downtown. Natural light illuminated the spacious room where power and justice intersected daily. Behind the mahogany desk sat Nadia Okafor, wearing a crisp orange blazer over blue pants, her posture reflecting the authority she'd earned through years of fighting for civil rights. The weight of her position as the state's top legal officer was evident in every measured movement as she reviewed a stack of disturbing documents that would change everything. Across from her desk stood FBI agent Isaiah Carrington, his muscular frame filling out his formal charcoal suit with the confidence of someone who'd spent years bringing down corruption at the highest levels. His expression was grim as he placed additional files on her desk, each one representing another family torn apart by a system meant to protect children, but corrupted by greed and racism. General Okafor, these complaints started coming in 6 months ago. Agent Carrington began, his deep voice carrying the weight of evidence that demanded action. At first, they seemed like isolated incidents, frustrated mothers losing custody battles, claiming racial bias. But when we started connecting the patterns, we found something much more sinister. Nadia opened the first file, her jaw tightening as she read testimony from Keisha Williams, a registered nurse and single mother who'd lost custody of her 8-year-old daughter despite having no history of abuse or neglect. The psychological evaluation had deemed her emotionally unstable and culturally unsuitable for raising a child in modern society. The language made Nadia's blood boil with its thinly veiled racism. "Every single one of these mothers is black," Nadia observed, flipping through case after case of similar outcomes. "Every single psychological evaluator found them unfit. Every single judge ruled against them." Agent Carrington nodded grimly. 17 cases in the past 18 months, all handled by the same network of court officials. Judge Edmund Prescott presiding, Dr. Harold Brennan conducting evaluations, Detective Maxine Guerrero investigating family backgrounds. The children all end up in the same private foster care facilities that charge the state premium rates. The office door opened, and Attorney Constance Diallo entered, wearing a striking red dress that commanded attention. As one of Nadia's most trusted legal advisors, Constance had spent weeks analyzing the legal implications of what they were discovering. Her usually bright demeanor was somber as she carried another folder of evidence. "The financial trail is devastating," Constance reported, placing bank records on the desk. "These private facilities are paying kickbacks to court officials. Judge Prescott's wife sits on the board of directors for Happy Hearts Foster Services. Detective Guerrero's brother owns the company that provides security for the facilities. Dr. Brennan receives consulting fees that are triple the normal rate for custody evaluations." Nadia stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city she'd sworn to serve and protect. Somewhere in those streets were mothers crying themselves to sleep, children wondering why they couldn't go home, and corrupt officials counting money earned from destroying black families. The systematic nature of the operation was breathtaking in its cruelty and efficiency. Dr. Lydia Anderson knocked and entered, her white coat indicating she'd come directly from her practice as a child psychologist. As one of the few honest professionals in the field, she'd been documenting irregularities in custody evaluations for months. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, and her expression reflected the gravity of what she'd discovered. "The psychological profiles are completely fabricated," Dr. Anderson announced without preamble. "Dr. Brennan is using outdated, racially biased assessment tools that pathologize normal cultural behaviors in Black families. He's diagnosing mothers with personality disorders that don't exist in legitimate psychiatric literature. These evaluations wouldn't pass peer review in any accredited institution." Agent Carrington pulled up surveillance photos on his tablet, showing Judge Prescott meeting with private facility owners at expensive restaurants. "We have documented proof of conspiracy, but proving it in court will require evidence that can't be dismissed or suppressed. These people control the very system we'd need to use to prosecute them." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Traditional investigation methods wouldn't work when the investigators, judges, and key witnesses were all part of the same corrupt network. They needed an approach that would gather irrefutable evidence while exposing the systematic racism that allowed this conspiracy to flourish. Nadia turned from the window, her decision crystallizing with the weight of justice on her shoulders. "We go undercover. I become one of those mothers fighting for her children. We document everything from the inside." Constance shook her head immediately. "Nadia, you can't risk your career like this. If your identity is discovered, every case you've ever prosecuted could be questioned. Your entire legacy could be destroyed." "My legacy means nothing if I allow this corruption to continue," Nadia replied firmly. "How many more children will be stolen from their mothers while we conduct traditional investigations? How many more families will be destroyed while we follow proper procedures?" Agent Carrington leaned forward, recognizing the determination in her voice. "An undercover operation would require creating a complete false identity. Background, employment history, reason for the custody dispute. It would have to be perfect because they'll investigate every detail." Dr. Anderson nodded thoughtfully. "The psychological evaluation process typically takes 6 weeks. During that time, you'd be subjected to intensive questioning, background checks, and surveillance. Any inconsistency in your cover story would expose the entire operation." Constance began pacing, her legal mind working through the complications. "We'd need to create court documents, employment records, residential history. The story would have to explain why you're in family court, why you don't have expensive legal representation, and why you fit their target profile. Single mother, working class job, no family support system," Nadia outlined, already building her cover identity. "Recent divorce, ex-husband claiming I'm unfit due to work stress and financial struggles. Perfect victim for their systematic bias." Agent Carrington pulled out his secure phone, already making mental notes about surveillance equipment and backup protocols. "We'd need eyes and ears throughout the courthouse, hidden cameras, audio recording devices, digital monitoring of all communications. The FBI surveillance team would have to maintain operational security while being ready to intervene if the situation escalates." The natural light shifted as clouds passed overhead, casting shadows across the office that seemed to reflect the dangerous path they were considering. Nadia understood that once she stepped into that courthouse as a vulnerable single mother, she'd be entering enemy territory without the protection of her official position. Dr. Anderson spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of professional responsibility. "The psychological evaluation will be invasive and deliberately humiliating. Dr. Brennan uses tactics designed to break down women's confidence and create emotional responses he can use against them in court. You'll have to endure personal attacks while maintaining perfect emotional control." Constance sat down heavily, understanding that legal arguments wouldn't change Nadia's mind once she'd decided on a course of action. "The documentation will take 2 weeks to establish properly. We'll need to create a rental history, employment records with a local company, and medical records that support the custody dispute narrative." "How do we ensure my safety if the operation goes wrong?" Nadia asked practically. Agent Carrington's expression became even more serious. "Emergency extraction protocols, panic signals, backup surveillance teams. But if your cover is blown while you're in their custody, there could be a window where we can't immediately help you." The office became quiet, except for the distant sounds of traffic below. Everyone understood they were discussing an operation that could either expose systematic corruption at the highest levels or destroy the career of the state's top law enforcement official. Nadia looked at each team member, seeing their dedication to justice reflected in their willingness to support such a dangerous plan. These families trusted the system to protect their children. Instead, they found corruption that destroyed their lives for profit. If we don't act, this network will continue operating with complete impunity. Dr. Anderson nodded first, followed by Agent Carrington and finally Constance. The decision was made with the understanding that they were embarking on an investigation that would either bring down a corrupt network or cost them their careers. Operation Family Justice begins now, Nadia declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone ready to sacrifice everything for the cause of justice. The morning sun continued streaming through the windows, illuminating their faces as they began planning the most important undercover operation of their careers. The fluorescent lights in the FBI field office cast a bright, sterile glow across the evidence boards that lined the walls like a gallery of corruption. Natural sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating every damning detail that Agent Isaiah Carrington and Nadia Okafor had meticulously assembled over the past 3 weeks. The muscular FBI agent, dressed in his crisp white dress shirt and dark blue tie, pointed to a web of red strings connecting photographs, financial documents, and court records. Nadia stood beside him, her orange blazer and blue pants, a stark contrast to the gravity of what they'd uncovered. Her eyes moved methodically across the evidence board, taking in each connection with the practiced precision of someone who'd built countless cases. But this wasn't just any case. This was personal now. What we discovered goes far beyond one racist judge, Isaiah said, his voice heavy with the weight of their findings. Judge Edmund Prescott is just the tip of the iceberg. We're looking at a systematic network of corruption that's been destroying black families for years. The evidence board revealed a spider web of connections that made Nadia's stomach turn. At the center sat Judge Prescott's photograph, connected by red strings to at least a dozen other individuals. Detective Maxine Guerrero's police department photo showed her in her short-sleeved uniform, her smug expression now taking on a more sinister meaning as Nadia understood her role in the conspiracy. Detective Guerrero has been fabricating police reports to support custody removals, Isaiah continued, tapping her photograph with his pen. She creates false domestic violence claims, drug possession charges that mysteriously disappear after the children are removed, and noise complaints from neighbors who don't exist. Financial records spread across the table told an even more disturbing story. Bank statements, wire transfers, and deposit slips created a paper trail that revealed the true motivation behind the systematic targeting of black families. The numbers were staggering, and each transaction represented a family torn apart for profit. The private foster care agencies are paying kickbacks for every child placed in their system, Nadia said, her voice barely containing her rage as she examined the financial documents. Trinity Foster Services alone has paid out over $200,000 in the past 18 months. That's money that comes directly from state funding meant to protect children. Isaiah pulled up another set of documents, revealing the extent of bailiff Reginald Bauer's involvement in the scheme. Security footage from courthouse cameras showed him intimidating families, physically blocking access to public defenders, and even confiscating cell phones to prevent families from recording proceedings. Bowers controls the courtroom environment completely, Isaiah explained, pointing to timestamps on various video files. He schedules hearings at impossible times, fails to notify families of court dates, and creates an atmosphere of intimidation that prevents proper legal defense. Watch this. The surveillance footage played on Isaiah's computer screen, showing Reginald Bowers, a heavy-set man in his courthouse uniform, aggressively approaching a young black mother trying to use her phone outside the courtroom. His body language was unmistakably threatening as he confiscated her device, claiming photography wasn't allowed anywhere in the building. But the corruption ran deeper still. Court reporter Teresa Manning had been systematically altering transcripts, removing evidence of judicial bias, and inserting fabricated statements that painted black mothers in the worst possible light. Isaiah displayed before and after versions of the same transcript, showing how Manning had transformed Judge Prescott's clearly biased statements into seemingly neutral judicial observations. She's been doing this for over 3 years, Isaiah said, highlighting the differences between the original recordings and the official transcripts. Every time Judge Prescott makes a racially charged comment or reveals his bias, Manning scrubs it from the official record. Families who try to appeal have no evidence of misconduct because the transcripts have been sanitized. The psychological evaluation scheme, orchestrated by Dr. Harold Brennan, represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of the entire operation. The elderly man's credentials seemed impressive on paper, but his evaluation methods told a different story. Every single psychological assessment he'd conducted on black mothers over the past 2 years had resulted in findings of unfitness for custody. Dr. Brennan charges 3 times the standard rate for his evaluations, Nadia observed, reviewing his billing records. The court specifically requests him for cases involving black families, and he's never once found a black mother fit for custody. The statistical impossibility of that outcome should have raised red flags years ago. Attorney Constance Diallo entered the field office wearing her red dress, her arms full of additional case files from families who had reached out after word of the investigation began spreading through the community. Her expression was grim as she set the files down on an already overcrowded table. "We've got 17 more families who want to share their stories," Constance said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The pattern is identical in every case. Fabricated charges, biased evaluations, intimidation tactics, and children removed without proper legal representation." Reverend Monroe Haynes arrived shortly after, his blue jacket making him easily identifiable as he entered the bright office space. The community leader's usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain as he carried testimonies from dozens of families affected by the corrupt network. "The community has been trying to speak out about this for years," Reverend Haynes said, his deep voice filled with frustration. "Every time a family tried to challenge the system, they faced retaliation, more charges, longer separations, threats against their remaining children. The fear kept everyone silent." The personal stories that emerged painted a picture of systematic terrorism against black families. Isaiah played recorded interviews with affected mothers, their voices breaking as they described the moment their children were taken away. One mother, Maria, described how Detective Guerrero had arrested her on fabricated drug charges just hours before a custody hearing, ensuring she couldn't appear in court to defend herself. "They took my babies while I was sitting in a jail cell for drugs they planted in my car." Maria's voice crackled through the speakers. "When I finally got to court 3 days later, Judge Prescott acted like I had abandoned my children voluntarily. Dr. Brennan said my pattern of drug abuse and parental abandonment made me unfit for custody. I've never used drugs in my life." Another testimony came from Keisha, whose children had been removed after a noise complaint that Detective Guerrero had fabricated. The supposed complaint came from an apartment that had been vacant for 6 months, but the court accepted it as evidence of Keisha's inability to maintain a stable living environment. "My kids were honor roll students, never missed school, never hungry." Keisha's recorded voice trembled with emotion, but somehow Dr. Brennan found that I was psychologically unstable and creating an unsafe environment. The bailiff wouldn't let me speak during the hearing. Every time I tried to defend myself, he threatened to hold me in contempt. The financial records revealed the true scope of the operation's profitability. Trinity Foster Services had received state payments totaling over $1.2 million for children removed through Judge Prescott's court in the past 2 years alone. The agency's contracts specified higher reimbursement rates for children removed due to psychological unfitness of parents, creating a direct financial incentive for Dr. Brennan's consistently negative evaluations. Isaiah displayed phone records showing regular communication between all the key players in the network. Judge Prescott had called Detective Guerrero over 40 times in the past 6 months, far more contact than necessary for any legitimate court business. Dr. Brennan's phone records showed similar patterns of communication with the judge, often occurring just before scheduled custody evaluations. "We've been monitoring their phone calls for 2 weeks, Isaiah explained, pulling up audio files on his computer. "What we've captured is beyond anything we imagined." The recordings played through the office speakers, filling the room with Judge Prescott's voice as he used racial slurs to describe the families appearing in his court. His casual racism was shocking enough, but his discussions of financial arrangements with the foster care agencies revealed the calculated nature of their scheme. These people breed like rabbits and expect the state to take care of their problems. Judge Prescott's recorded voice said during a call with Dr. Brennan, "The sooner we get these kids into proper homes, the better. Make sure your evaluation emphasizes the mother's inability to provide stability. Trinity pays better for long-term placements." Nadia's hands clenched into fists as she listened to Judge Prescott's voice discussing her own case, referring to her as another ghetto queen who thinks she deserves what decent people work for. His confidence in his own immunity was evident in every conversation, never imagining that anyone had the power or authority to challenge his systematic racism. The evidence revealed that the corruption network had successfully removed children from over 60 black families in the past 3 years. The psychological trauma inflicted on both parents and children was immeasurable, but the financial profit had exceeded $2 million in foster care payments and kickbacks. Dr. Lydia Anderson's analysis of Dr. Brennan's evaluation methods revealed deliberate bias built into every assessment. He used culturally biased testing methods, asked leading questions designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted negatively, and consistently ignored positive evidence of parental fitness. His reports followed identical templates regardless of the individual circumstances of each family. Dr. Brennan's evaluations aren't psychological assessments, Dr. Anderson explained to the team. They're predetermined character assassinations designed to justify custody removal. His methodology violates every standard of ethical psychological practice. The scope of the network's reach extended beyond the immediate court officials. Administrative staff had been complicit in scheduling hearings without proper notification, losing important documents, and creating procedural barriers that prevented families from accessing proper legal representation. Even some court-appointed attorneys had been steering their clients toward accepting plea deals and custody arrangements that served the network's interests rather than their clients' rights. As the afternoon sun continued streaming through the FBI office windows, the team realized they weren't just dealing with individual corruption, but with systematic institutional racism designed to separate black children from their families for profit. Every level of the family court system had been compromised, creating a pipeline that funneled vulnerable families toward predetermined outcomes regardless of evidence or justice. The evidence boards now covered every wall of the office, connected by hundreds of red strings that mapped out relationships, financial transactions, and communication patterns. Phone records, bank statements, video surveillance, audio recordings, and witness testimonies created an overwhelming case against every member of the corrupt network. But for Nadia, standing in that brightly lit office, surrounded by evidence of systematic injustice, the personal cost was becoming clear. Her undercover investigation had revealed a level of corruption that demanded justice, but pursuing that justice would require her to continue enduring Judge Prescott's racism while building an even stronger case. The corruption network had operated with impunity for years, destroying dozens of black families while generating millions in profit. Now, for the first time, someone with the power to fight back was gathering the evidence needed to bring them all down. 2 weeks had passed since that humiliating custody hearing, and Nadia Okafor had settled into the rhythm of her undercover life in the modest apartment complex on Riverside Drive. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window as she prepared coffee, wearing her green cotton top and blue denim jacket. The bright fluorescent lights overhead illuminated the small space she now called home, a far cry from her actual penthouse downtown. Every detail of this fabricated existence had to be perfect. Every moment lived as if she truly were the struggling single mother the courts believed her to be. The knock on her door came at exactly 9:15, sharp and authoritative. Through the peephole, Nadia saw Detective Maxine Guerrero standing in the hallway, her long-sleeved police uniform, crisp and official under the complex's overhead lighting. 2 uniformed officers flanked her, their faces stern and unforgiving in the bright morning light. "Nadia Johnson, open up. We have a warrant for your arrest," Detective Guerrero called out, using the false name that had become Nadia's identity for this investigation. Nadia's heart raced, but she forced herself to respond as the character she was playing would. "What? There must be some mistake," she said, opening the door with trembling hands that weren't entirely acting. The hallway's fluorescent bulbs cast harsh shadows across Detective Guerrero's face, highlighting the cold satisfaction in her eyes. "No mistake, Detective Guerrero said, pulling out handcuffs with practiced efficiency. "You're under arrest for violating court orders regarding custody arrangements and for child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." "Child endangerment? What are you talking about? I haven't even seen my daughter since the hearing," Nadia protested, knowing full well this was all fabricated, but needing to maintain her cover. The natural light from the hallway windows mixed with the artificial lighting, creating a surreal atmosphere as her world seemed to collapse around her. Detective Guerrero roughly grabbed Nadia's wrists, the metal cuffs clicking into place with finality. "We have reports that you attempted unauthorized contact with the minor child and made threats against court personnel. You can explain it to the judge." Neighbors began emerging from their apartments, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Patterson from 3B peered out nervously, while the Rodriguez family from across the hall watched with wide eyes. The shame was overwhelming, even knowing it was all part of the investigation. The bright hallway lighting seemed to spotlight every moment of her humiliation as Detective Guerrero paraded her toward the elevator. "This is harassment," Nadia said, her voice carrying just the right amount of desperation and outrage. "I followed every single rule the court set. I haven't violated anything. Save it for the judge," Detective Guerrero replied coldly, her long-sleeved uniform rustling as she guided Nadia into the elevator. The fluorescent lights inside cast everything in stark relief, making the moment feel even more surreal. 3 blocks away, FBI agent Isaiah Carrington sat in an unmarked surveillance van, listening to every word through the wire Nadia wore. His muscular frame tensed with each degrading comment, his hands clenched into fists, as he watched the woman he'd come to deeply respect being treated like a common criminal. The morning sun beat down on the van's roof while he struggled with the hardest part of any undercover operation, watching injustice unfold without intervening. "We have to do something," Agent Torres whispered from the passenger seat, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't blow the operation," Isaiah replied through gritted teeth. Though every instinct screamed at him to storm that apartment building, she knew this might happen. The whole network has to fall, not just one dirty cop. At the courthouse, Judge Edmund Prescott had already been notified of the arrest. He sat in his chambers, the overhead fluorescent lighting reflecting off his bald head as he smiled with satisfaction. The morning sunlight streaming through his office windows seemed to energize his cruelty as he prepared for what he believed would be his final victory over this troublesome woman. "Expedite the hearing," he told his clerk over the phone. "I want her in front of me within the hour, and make sure her attorney isn't properly notified. We'll claim the messages weren't delivered in time." The courthouse buzzed with activity under its bright lighting system as word spread about the emergency hearing. In her law office across town, attorney Constance Diallo received a call that made her blood run cold. She grabbed her red blazer and rushed toward the door, knowing she had minutes to get to the courthouse before Judge Prescott could railroad Nadia without proper representation. The holding cell where they placed Nadia was deliberately uncomfortable, with harsh fluorescent lighting that never dimmed and a constant chill that seemed designed to break spirits. She sat on the metal bench, her green top and blue jacket providing little warmth, and forced herself to think like the woman she was pretending to be, rather than the state attorney general she actually was. "First time?" asked another woman in the cell, her voice hollow with experience. "Yes," Nadia replied honestly, though not for the reasons the woman assumed. Prescott's courtroom? "How did you know?" The woman laughed bitterly. "Honey, all of us black mothers end up here eventually. That judge has it out for us. I lost my kids 2 years ago. Same song, different verse. Suddenly I was unfit. Suddenly I was dangerous. Suddenly I was everything wrong with motherhood." The stories that followed made Nadia's undercover suffering feel small compared to the real devastation these women had endured. Each tale of separated families and destroyed lives strengthened her resolve, even as the harsh lighting and cold concrete tested her physical endurance. When they finally brought her to the courtroom, the bright overhead fluorescent lights and natural sunlight streaming through the tall windows created the same sterile atmosphere she remembered from 2 weeks ago. Judge Edmund Prescott sat behind his bench like a king on his throne, his black robes making him appear even more imposing under the courthouse lighting. "Your Honor," This is highly irregular. Attorney Constance Diallo protested, having arrived just moments before the hearing began. Her red suit stood out boldly under the bright courtroom lights as she fought for her client. My client wasn't properly notified, and these charges appear to be fabricated. The defendant is a flight risk and a danger to the community, Judge Prescott declared, his voice echoing through the brightly lit courtroom. The evidence clearly shows she attempted to contact the minor child in violation of court orders and made threatening statements about court personnel. What evidence? Constance demanded. We haven't seen any reports, any witnesses, any documentation whatsoever. Judge Prescott's face twisted with the same racist contempt Nadia had witnessed before. Under the harsh courthouse lighting, his features looked even more cruel and vindictive. This woman represents everything wrong with today's society. Looking at her, sitting there in her cheap clothes, trying to play the victim, it's obvious she has no respect for law and order. The fluorescent lights seemed to buzz louder as his words filled the courtroom. Several court personnel exchanged knowing looks, while bailiff Reginald Bowers nodded approvingly from his position near the wall. People like her think they can intimidate the system, think they can use their sob stories and race cards to avoid consequences, Judge Prescott continued, his voice rising with each word. Well, not in my courtroom. Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody pending trial, and I'm recommending she be placed in the maximum security section to prevent any further attempts at manipulation or escape. Nadia felt the words hit her like physical blows, but she forced herself to respond as her character would. Your Honor, please. I have nowhere to run. I just want to see my daughter. I haven't done anything wrong. Save the theatrics, Judge Prescott snapped. Officers, remove this woman from my courtroom and make sure she understands that continued defiance will only make things worse for her. As the bailiffs led her away, Nadia caught sight of Isaiah Carrington in the gallery, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. The bright courtroom lighting illuminated the tension in his jaw as he watched the woman he was supposed to protect being dragged away in shackles. Back in the county jail, conditions deteriorated exactly as the corrupt network intended. The lights in her cell flickered constantly, sleep became impossible, and meals arrived cold and barely edible. Other inmates, clearly influenced by guards loyal to the corruption scheme, made her life miserable with constant harassment and threats. Word is, you pissed off the wrong people, one woman hissed during the first night. Judge Prescott don't like troublemakers, especially ones who think they're better than they are. The psychological pressure was intense, designed to break her spirit and force her to accept whatever custody arrangement the corrupt court imposed. But every moment of suffering only added to the federal case she was building, every abuse another nail in their coffin. Isaiah Carrington paced his hotel room that night, the city lights streaming through his window as he fought the urge to end the operation immediately. 3 days was the absolute maximum they could let this continue without risking permanent damage to their case and to Nadia herself. She's stronger than all of them combined, he whispered to himself, staring out at the night sky. 3 more days, and we bring down their entire world. In her cell, under the harsh and unrelenting fluorescent lighting, Nadia Okafor closed her eyes and reminded herself who she really was. Not the broken woman they thought they were destroying, but the state attorney general of the entire state. Soon, very soon, they would learn exactly who they had been tormenting. The countdown to justice had begun. The fluorescent lights in the county jail visiting room cast harsh shadows across the scratched metal table where Nadia Okafor sat waiting. 3 days in custody had taken their toll, but her resolve remained unshaken beneath the carefully maintained facade of a desperate mother. Her green top had wrinkled from sleeping on the thin jail mattress, and her blue jacket hung loosely on her shoulders as she fought to stay in character while the corruption network tightened their trap around her. The heavy door buzzed open, and a young man in an ill-fitting suit stumbled through, carrying a battered briefcase that had seen better days. Public Defender Marcus Chen looked overwhelmed before he even sat down, his nervous energy filling the bright room as morning sunlight streamed through the reinforced windows. Mrs. Johnson, he began, using her undercover identity. I have to be honest with you. This case has gotten much more complicated since your arrest." Nadia leaned forward, playing her role perfectly, as anxiety creased her features. "What do you mean? I didn't do anything wrong. I followed every rule they gave me." Marcus opened his briefcase with shaking hands, pulling out a thick folder that seemed to grow heavier with each page he turned. "They've added additional charges, violation of court orders, child endangerment, and now they're claiming you made threats against court personnel." The words hit like physical blows, each fabricated charge designed to destroy any chance of custody recovery. Nadia felt her jaw clench involuntarily before forcing herself to respond with appropriate shock and confusion, rather than the legal expertise that wanted to tear apart each baseless accusation. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice carrying the perfect tremor of a mother facing losing her children forever. "I never threatened anyone. I barely spoke during the hearing." "I believe you," Marcus said, though his tone suggested he'd heard similar denials countless times before. "But Judge Prescott has scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. He's petitioning for immediate and permanent termination of your parental rights." The room seemed to spin around Nadia as the full weight of the corruption network's escalation became clear. They weren't just targeting her undercover identity anymore. They were planning to make her a cautionary tale, a warning to any other black mother who dared challenge their systematic oppression. Across town in a sterile office building, Dr. Lydia Anderson sat at her computer screen, her red blouse catching the overhead lighting as she scrolled through disturbing documents that painted a picture of systematic fraud. Her investigation into Dr. Harold Brennan's psychological evaluations had uncovered a pattern so consistent it could only be intentional. Every black mother who came through the family court system received virtually identical diagnoses: antisocial personality disorder, substance abuse tendencies, inability to provide stable home environment. The language varied slightly, but the conclusions remained devastatingly consistent. Dr. Brennan had created a template for destroying black families, rubber-stamping evaluations that justified removing children from loving homes. Her phone rang, interrupting the mounting horror of her discoveries. FBI agent Isaiah Carrington's voice carried tension through the speaker. "Dr. Anderson, how solid is your evidence against Brennan?" "Rock solid," she replied, her voice hardening with professional determination. "He's been using fabricated psychological profiles for at least 2 years. I've identified 37 cases where black mothers received identical diagnostic language despite completely different circumstances. We need that documentation immediately. They're moving to permanently terminate Nadia's parental rights tomorrow." The urgency in Isaiah's voice reflected the pressure mounting on the entire investigation team. Every hour that Nadia remained in custody risked exposure of the operation, but breaking cover too early might allow the corruption network to destroy evidence and escape justice. Meanwhile, in the historic district where the courthouse dominated the skyline, Reverend Monroe Haynes adjusted his blue jacket against the morning chill as he organized what would become the largest demonstration the city had seen in decades. His weathered hands held a megaphone that would soon carry the voices of dozens of families destroyed by judicial corruption. "We gather not in anger, but in demand for justice," he told the growing crowd of supporters. "Too many of our children have been stolen by a system that profits from our pain." The crowd included mothers who had lost custody under suspicious circumstances, fathers denied visitation rights without cause, and community members who recognized the systematic targeting of black families. Their signs demanded accountability, justice, and the return of children to loving homes. Among them stood reporter Claudette Simmons, her red jacket making her easily identifiable as she moved through the crowd with her cameraman. Her investigation had begun as a routine follow-up on court statistics, but the numbers told a story too stark to ignore. Black children in this jurisdiction were removed from their families at rates nearly 4 times higher than other demographics, despite no corresponding difference in reported abuse or neglect. "The pattern is undeniable," she explained to her camera, the courthouse steps providing a dramatic backdrop. "When we examined case files, we found identical language being used to justify child removal across dozens of different families. This suggests either remarkable coincidence or systematic bias." Her broadcast would air during the evening news, just as FBI surveillance equipment captured the most damning evidence yet against Judge Edmund Prescott and his network of corruption. In his private chambers, Judge Prescott loosened his black robes and poured himself a generous glass of whiskey, unaware that every word he spoke was being recorded by federal agents. His conversation with Detective Maxine Guerrero revealed the true motivation behind their escalating persecution of Nadia's undercover identity. "This Johnson woman has gotten too much attention," Judge Prescott said, his voice carrying the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. "If we don't make an example of her, other mothers might start thinking they can challenge our decisions." Detective Guerrero, still wearing her long-sleeved police uniform from her shift, nodded her agreement. "My officers have prepared additional evidence for tomorrow's hearing. Traffic violations, suspicious associations, anything we need to make the termination stick." "Perfect," Judge Prescott replied, taking another sip of whiskey. "Once we destroy her completely, the others will fall in line. These people need to understand that questioning our authority has consequences." The casual racism in his tone revealed everything the investigation team needed to know about the systematic targeting of black families. This wasn't about child welfare or legal procedure. It was about power, control, and the profitable business of family destruction. Back in the jail visiting room, Nadia struggled to maintain her emotional composure as Marcus Chen outlined the hopeless legal position they faced. The fabricated charges had been carefully constructed to eliminate any avenue of appeal or defense. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked, knowing that revealing her true legal expertise would destroy months of careful investigation. Marcus shook his head sadly, his inexperience evident in every gesture. "Against Judge Prescott, in his own courtroom, I've never seen anyone successfully challenge one of his custody decisions." The admission revealed how deeply the corruption had infected the local legal system. Young attorneys learned quickly not to oppose Judge Prescott too vigorously, understanding that their careers depended on maintaining his favor. The systematic intimidation had created an environment where injustice flourished without challenge. As evening approached, the various threads of conspiracy and resistance began weaving together into a tapestry of impending confrontation. Dr. Lydia Anderson worked late into the night, preparing documentation that would expose Dr. Harold Brennan's fraudulent evaluations. Her office lights remained on as she printed evidence that would destroy the psychological foundation of dozens of unjust custody decisions. Reverend Monroe Haynes coordinated with community leaders across the city, organizing support for families who had suffered under the corrupt system. His church became a gathering place for mothers, sharing their stories, finding strength in solidarity as they prepared to demand accountability. Reporter Claudette Simmons edited her investigative piece, knowing that tomorrow's broadcast would bring national attention to a scandal that had festered in darkness for too long. Her red clothing made her a striking figure on camera as she delivered the facts that would change everything. FBI agent Isaiah Carrington reviewed surveillance footage and recorded conversations, building the federal case that would ultimately destroy the corruption network. His muscular frame carried the tension of watching Nadia suffer in custody while maintaining operational security that could determine the success or failure of their investigation. In her jail cell, Nadia lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, calculating the risks and benefits of maintaining her cover for one more day. The personal cost had become enormous, but the systematic nature of the corruption demanded complete exposure. Breaking cover too early might allow Judge Prescott and his associates to destroy evidence and escape justice. The fluorescent lighting in the jail never dimmed completely, creating an artificial twilight that reflected the liminal space between her public identity as State Attorney General and her current role as victim of the system she was working to reform. Every hour in custody provided additional evidence of how the corruption network operated, but also risked exposure that could compromise the entire investigation. Her decision to continue the undercover operation, despite mounting personal cost, demonstrated the kind of sacrifice that true justice sometimes demands. She understood that her suffering as a black woman in the custody system provided irreplaceable insight into how the corruption functioned on a daily basis. As night settled over the city, the forces of corruption and justice prepared for a confrontation that would determine the fate of countless families. Judge Edmund Prescott reviewed his plans to permanently destroy what he believed was simply another troublesome black mother who had dared to challenge his authority. He remained completely unaware that his target possessed the legal knowledge and federal connections necessary to dismantle his entire network of systematic oppression. His confidence in tomorrow's hearing would prove to be the final mistake in a career built on judicial misconduct and racial bias. The corruption network had reached the height of their arrogance, believing themselves untouchable as they prepared to make an example of Nadia Okafor. Their systematic destruction of black families had operated without consequences for so long that they could no longer imagine facing accountability for their actions. But federal surveillance captured every conversation. Dr. Lydia Anderson documented every fraudulent evaluation, and Reverend Monroe Haynes mobilized a community demand for justice that could no longer be ignored. Reporter Claudette Simmons prepared to broadcast the truth to a national audience hungry for accountability in their justice system. The stage was set for a revelation that would transform not only individual lives, but the entire family court system. Nadia Okafor's sacrifice during 3 days in custody had provided the federal government with everything needed to deliver comprehensive justice to those who had profited from family destruction. Tomorrow's emergency hearing would indeed make an example, but not in the way Judge Edmund Prescott anticipated. Instead of silencing one more black mother, his courtroom would become the stage for exposing systematic corruption that had destroyed dozens of families and traumatized countless children. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the promise of justice that had been too long delayed. The packed courthouse buzzed with tension under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights streaming down from the ceiling fixtures above. Natural sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long rectangles of brightness across the polished wooden floors and packed gallery benches. Judge Edmund Prescott sat confidently behind his elevated bench, his black robes pristine and imposing as he prepared for what he believed would be his final victory over the defiant black mother who had dared to challenge his authority. Nadia Okafor sat at the defendant's table, wearing her green top and blue jacket, her hands folded calmly, despite the gravity of the moment. To everyone watching, she appeared to be just another struggling single mother, about to lose her children to a corrupt system. The weight of 3 days in custody showed in the slight shadows under her eyes, but her posture remained straight and dignified. She had endured every humiliation, every racist comment, every manufactured charge to reach this pivotal moment. The gallery overflowed with community members, many of them mothers who had lost their own children to this very courtroom. Reverend Monroe Haynes sat in the front row, wearing his blue jacket, his weathered hands gripping his hat as he watched the proceedings with intense focus. Behind him, dozens of families who had been torn apart by Judge Edmund Prescott's corrupt rulings filled every available seat, their faces etched with pain and desperate hope. Reporter Claudette Simmons positioned herself strategically near the back, her camera crew ready to capture what promised to be a significant moment in the ongoing investigation into family court corruption. The media attention had been building for weeks, drawing national scrutiny to the unusual patterns of custody decisions in this jurisdiction. Judge Edmund Prescott cleared his throat, relishing what he believed would be his moment of absolute triumph. We are here today for the final determination of custody in the matter of Okafor versus the state. Based on the defendant's continued violations of court orders, including her recent arrest and the mounting evidence of her unfitness as a mother, this court is prepared to terminate all parental rights permanently. His voice carried the same condescending tone that had characterized every interaction with Nadia Okafor, the same barely concealed racial contempt that had driven him to call her ghetto trash during their first encounter. Court bailiff Reginald Bowers stood nearby, his uniform crisp and his expression smugly satisfied as he anticipated another victory for their corrupt network. Detective Maxine Guerrero sat in the gallery, wearing her long-sleeved police uniform, her arms crossed as she watched the woman she had arrested on fabricated charges finally face what she considered appropriate consequences. The corrupt officer had personally ensured that the jail conditions were as unpleasant as possible, believing that breaking down defiant black mothers sent a clear message to others who might challenge the system. Dr. Harold Brennan occupied a seat near the prosecution table, his fraudulent psychological evaluation ready to be submitted as final evidence of Nadia Okafor's mental unfitness. The corrupt psychiatrist had built his reputation on finding black mothers unstable and dangerous, his reports consistently recommending the removal of children from their families. His partnership with Judge Edmund Prescott had destroyed countless families over the years, generating substantial profits for both men. As Judge Edmund Prescott lifted his gavel to deliver what he expected to be the final ruling, the heavy courtroom doors burst open with a resounding crash that echoed through the chamber like thunder. FBI agent Isaiah Carrington strode through the entrance, his muscular frame filling his formal dark suit as he led a team of federal marshals into the packed courtroom. The sudden intrusion sent a wave of confused murmurs through the gallery as federal agents positioned themselves strategically throughout the room. Judge Edmund Prescott's confident expression faltered for the first time, his hand freezing midair with the gavel still raised as he tried to process this unexpected development. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" Judge Edmund Prescott demanded, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted to maintain his authority. "This is a state custody hearing, and I will not tolerate federal interference in my courtroom." FBI agent Isaiah Carrington approached the bench with measured steps, his badge clearly visible as he addressed the confused judge. "Your Honor, I am Special Agent Isaiah Carrington with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are here on a matter of urgent federal business that directly pertains to these proceedings." Attorney Constance Diallo rose from her seat at the defense table, her red suit blazing under the bright courthouse lighting as she commanded attention from every person in the packed chamber. Her voice rang clear and strong as she prepared to deliver the revelation that would shatter everything. Judge Edmund Prescott thought he knew about this case. "Your Honor, before this court proceeds with any ruling, there is a critical matter that must be addressed regarding the true identity of my client." Constance Diallo's words carried the weight of absolute authority as she gestured toward Nadia Okafor, who remained seated calmly despite the chaos erupting around her. Judge Edmund Prescott's face began to drain of color as a terrible suspicion crept into his consciousness. The woman he had insulted, humiliated, and imprisoned might not be the powerless single mother he had assumed. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of his bench, suddenly aware that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully controlled courtroom. "The defendant you have been addressing as a struggling single mother named Nadia Okafor is in fact the State Attorney General of this state," Constance Diallo announced with crystal clarity. "She has been conducting an undercover federal investigation into corruption and civil rights violations within this family court system." The courtroom exploded into chaos as the full implications of this revelation hit everyone simultaneously. Gallery members gasped and stood, craning their necks to get a better look at the woman they now realized held the highest law enforcement position in the state. Judge Edmund Prescott's gavel slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the bench as his face went completely white with shock and dawning horror. Nadia Okafor finally stood, her demeanor transforming completely as she shed the vulnerable persona she had maintained for months. The frightened single mother disappeared, replaced by the commanding presence of the state's top prosecutor. Her voice carried absolute authority as she addressed the stunned courtroom. "For the past 3 months, I have endured the systematic racism, corruption, and abuse of power that characterizes this court's treatment of black families," Nadia Okafor declared, her words echoing through the silent chamber. "Every insult, every fabricated charge, every violation of my civil rights has been documented and recorded as evidence in a federal investigation." Judge Edmund Prescott struggled to find his voice. His earlier confidence completely evaporated as the magnitude of his situation became clear. The woman he had called ghetto trash, whose children he had threatened to permanently remove, stood before him as the most powerful legal official in the state. Every racist comment, every biased ruling, every corrupt decision had been made in full view of someone with the authority to destroy his career and send him to prison. FBI agent Isaiah Carrington stepped forward with a team of federal marshals, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights as they began the systematic arrest of the corruption network. "Detective Maxine Guerrero, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, falsifying police reports, and abuse of authority under color of law. Detective Maxine Guerrero shot to her feet in her police uniform, her face flushed with rage and panic as federal agents approached her position. "This is impossible. She's just another welfare mother trying to game the system." Her protests fell on deaf ears as handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the sound sharp and final in the tense courtroom atmosphere. Bailiff Reginald Bowers attempted to flee toward a side exit, but federal marshals blocked his path with swift efficiency. His usual swagger disappeared entirely as he found himself surrounded by agents who had been documenting his role in intimidating families and preventing access to proper legal representation. "Reginald Bowers, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations," announced one of the marshals as handcuffs secured the corrupt bailiff's hands behind his back. His face crumpled with the realization that his comfortable position enabling judicial corruption had come to a permanent end. Dr. Harold Brennan rose from his seat near the prosecution table, his face pale as he watched his co-conspirators being arrested around him. The psychiatrist who had built his career on fraudulent evaluations targeting black mothers suddenly found himself facing the consequences of years of systematic racism disguised as professional opinion. Federal agents approached Dr. Harold Brennan with warrant in hand, their voices carrying across the courtroom as they read the charges. "Dr. Harold Brennan, you are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and falsifying professional evaluations in federal court proceedings." The corrupt psychiatrist offered no resistance as handcuffs secured his hands, his reputation and career destroyed in a single moment. Court reporter Teresa Manning attempted to gather her equipment and slip toward an exit, but FBI agents had positioned themselves to prevent any escape attempts. Her role in falsifying transcripts to hide evidence of judicial bias had been thoroughly documented through the federal investigation. "Teresa Manning, you are under arrest for falsifying official court documents, conspiracy and obstruction of justice," declared the arresting agent as the corrupt court reporter joined her co-conspirators in federal custody. Her carefully maintained facade of professional competence crumbled as the handcuffs clicked into place. Judge Edmund Prescott finally found his voice, though it emerged as a strangled whisper that barely carried beyond his bench. "This is impossible. There must be some mistake. I am a sitting judge with decades of experience and an impeccable reputation." FBI agent Isaiah Carrington approached the bench with a digital recording device, his expression professionally neutral as he prepared to destroy Judge Edmund Prescott's desperate denials with the man's own words. "Your Honor, we have extensive audio and video recordings of your conduct throughout this investigation. Perhaps you would like to hear some examples of your impeccable reputation." The first recording crackled to life over the courtroom sound system, Judge Edmund Prescott's voice clearly audible as he spoke on the phone with one of his co-conspirators. "Another ghetto mother thinking she can challenge my authority. Make sure the arrest report includes drug possession charges, even if you have to plant something. These people need to learn their place." Judge Edmund Prescott's face went from white to gray as his own voice filled the courtroom, his racist language and casual discussion of fabricating evidence playing for everyone to hear. Gallery members who had suffered under his corrupt rulings listened with growing satisfaction as their tormentor's true nature was finally exposed. A second recording began playing, this one capturing Judge Edmund Prescott discussing financial arrangements with the private foster care agencies that profited from removing black children from their families. "Each placement nets us $1,500, and these people rarely have the resources to fight back effectively. It's easy money, and we're doing society a favor by getting these kids away from unfit parents." The community members in the gallery began standing and applauding as years of suppressed anger and pain found release through these revelations. Mothers who had lost their children, fathers who had been denied visitation, and extended families torn apart by corrupt rulings finally heard validation that their suffering had been deliberate and criminal. Reverend Monroe Haynes rose from his front row seat, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched justice finally arrive for his community. The families he had counseled through their darkest moments, the mothers he had held as they sobbed over their stolen children, would finally see their tormentors face consequences. A third recording played Judge Edmund Prescott's voice discussing Nadia Okafor specifically, his words dripping with racial contempt and confidence in his untouchable position. This particular one thinks she's special, coming in here with her attitude and her demands. I'm going to make an example of her that every other welfare mother in this city will remember. By the time I'm finished, she'll be lucky to get supervised visits." Judge Edmund Prescott attempted to speak, to offer some explanation or denial, but his voice failed completely as the weight of his situation crushed down upon him. The woman he had called ghetto trash sat watching him with calm satisfaction, her true identity as State Attorney General, making his racist attacks not just morally reprehensible, but legally catastrophic. Reporter Claudette Simmons and her camera crew captured every moment of the dramatic confrontation, the footage that would soon broadcast nationwide, showing the complete collapse of a corrupt judicial network. The story of systematic racism in family courts would reach audiences across the country, inspiring similar investigations in other jurisdictions. Federal marshals approached Judge Edmund Prescott's bench with handcuffs ready, their voices carrying clearly through the now silent courtroom. "Judge Edmund Prescott, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, racketeering, and corruption. You have the right to remain silent." The sight of Judge Edmund Prescott in handcuffs, his black robes disheveled, and his face crumpled in defeat, sent waves of emotional catharsis through the gallery. Families who had been powerless against his corrupt authority watched their tormentor face the same helplessness they had experienced. As federal agents led the arrested corruption network from the courtroom, Nadia Okafor addressed the packed gallery with the full authority of her position as State Attorney General. Her sacrifice of enduring months of humiliation and abuse had finally paid off in complete vindication for every family that had suffered under this corrupt system. The truth had emerged with devastating clarity, transforming victim into victor and exposing the systematic racism that had destroyed countless black families. Justice had finally arrived in Judge Edmund Prescott's courtroom, delivered by the very woman he had underestimated and insulted, marking the beginning of comprehensive reform and accountability in the family court system. The morning sun streamed through the towering windows of the federal courthouse, casting brilliant rays across the marble floors as the wheels of justice finally began to turn with unstoppable momentum. The overhead fluorescent lighting illuminated every corner of the grand courtroom where federal prosecutors prepared to dismantle the corruption network that had destroyed countless black families. Today would mark the beginning of the most comprehensive civil rights prosecution the state had seen in decades. State Attorney General Nadia Okafor stood confidently at the prosecutor's table, her official orange blazer and blue pants a stark contrast to the humble disguise she had worn during her undercover operation. Her transformation back to her true position of power was complete, and the evidence boxes stacked beside her represented months of meticulous investigation and personal sacrifice. The same woman who had been called ghetto trash by Judge Edmund Prescott now commanded the respect of federal agents, prosecutors, and media representatives, filling every seat in the courtroom. FBI agent Isaiah Carrington, his muscular frame impressive in his formal federal suit, approached the witness stand carrying surveillance recordings that would seal the fate of every corrupt official involved in the conspiracy. His testimony would detail the extensive federal investigation that had captured hundreds of hours of incriminating conversations, financial records showing illegal kickbacks, and documented civil rights violations that spanned several years of systematic racism. Judge Edmund Prescott sat at the defendant's table, his black robes replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his arrogant demeanor completely shattered as he faced the reality of decades in federal prison. The same man who had wielded his judicial power like a weapon against vulnerable black families now trembled as federal prosecutors outlined charges of civil rights violations, conspiracy, racketeering, and fraud. His court-appointed attorney shuffled papers nervously, knowing the mountain of evidence made any defense virtually impossible. The lead federal prosecutor stood and addressed the packed courtroom with unwavering authority. The evidence against Judge Edmund Prescott includes recorded conversations using racial slurs and discussing financial arrangements with private foster care agencies that profited from removing black children from their families. The defendant violated his oath of office and betrayed the fundamental principles of equal justice under law. His actions caused immeasurable harm to dozens of families and undermined public trust in our judicial system. Detective Maxine Guerrero occupied another defendant's table, her police uniform stripped away permanently as she faced criminal prosecution for falsifying evidence and conspiracy charges. The woman who had arrested Nadia Okafor on fabricated charges now understood the consequences of participating in systematic oppression. Her badge, weapon, and authority had been revoked, and her law enforcement career was over forever. Federal investigators had uncovered her role in creating false police reports and intimidating families who challenged the corrupt court system. Dr. Harold Brennan, the psychologist who had written fraudulent evaluations condemning black mothers as unfit parents, sat facing fraud charges and the permanent loss of his professional license. His fake diagnosis had been instrumental in separating children from their families, and federal prosecutors had evidence of his financial motivations for consistently finding black mothers mentally unstable or dangerous. The systematic nature of his biased evaluations revealed a pattern of discrimination that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Court reporter Teresa Manning faced felony charges for falsifying official transcripts to hide evidence of judicial bias and racist language. Her role in the conspiracy involved altering court records to protect Judge Edmund Prescott and other corrupt officials from accountability. The integrity of the legal system depended on accurate documentation, and her betrayal of that trust carried serious federal consequences that would result in prison time and permanent disbarment from court reporting. The private foster care agencies involved in the kickback scheme found themselves under intense federal investigation as authorities seized their assets and froze their accounts. These organizations had profited enormously from the artificial increase in black children removed from their families through fraudulent court proceedings. Federal auditors discovered millions of dollars in suspicious transactions and inflated fees that revealed the financial incentives driving the systematic family destruction. Attorney Constance Diallo, wearing her professional red suit, presented comprehensive documentation of the civil rights violations suffered by each affected family. Her legal team had worked tirelessly to identify every case influenced by the corruption network and calculate appropriate compensation for the emotional trauma, legal expenses, and family disruption caused by the fraudulent proceedings. The federal government would provide substantial settlements to help these families rebuild their lives and access counseling services. In a separate courthouse across the city, Judge Roberta Nakashima, wearing her professional judicial attire, presided over emergency hearings designed to reverse the fraudulent custody decisions that had torn apart so many families. The bright courtroom lighting seemed symbolic of the transparency and fairness that had been absent from Judge Edmund Prescott's proceedings. Each case received careful review to determine which custody modifications had been based on legitimate concerns versus racist bias and fabricated evidence. The first family reunification brought tears of joy as LaShonda Williams embraced her 2 young sons after 8 months of separation based on Dr. Harold Brennan's fraudulent psychological evaluation. The children had been placed in foster care despite no evidence of abuse or neglect, solely because Judge Edmund Prescott had predetermined that black single mothers were inherently unfit parents. Judge Roberta Nakashima personally apologized for the judicial system's failure and promised comprehensive reforms to prevent future discrimination. Marcus and Keisha Thompson held their infant daughter for the first time in 6 months after Detective Maxine Guerrero's false police reports had been used to justify emergency custody removal. The baby had been thriving in their care until the corrupt network targeted their family as part of the systematic persecution of black parents. The emotional reunion took place in Judge Roberta Nakashima's courtroom, with Reverend Monroe Haynes providing spiritual support and community witnesses celebrating the restoration of family bonds. Reverend Monroe Haynes, distinguished in his blue jacket, coordinated community healing services as more families experienced the joy of reunification. His church became a sanctuary where parents shared their experiences and children received counseling to process their traumatic separation from loving families. The community support network he established helped families navigate the legal process of having their names cleared from false abuse registries and accessing compensation for their suffering. The Reverend organized weekly support group meetings where parents could discuss their experiences with systematic racism in the family court system. These gatherings provided emotional healing and practical assistance as families worked to rebuild trust and stability after months or years of separation. Licensed therapists donated their services to help children understand that their removal from their families had nothing to do with their parents' love or their own behavior. Reporter Claudette Simmons received national recognition for her investigative journalism that had helped expose the widespread nature of family court corruption. Her articles documenting the disproportionate removal of black children from stable homes had attracted federal attention and provided crucial media coverage during the investigation. Major news networks now featured her expertise on systematic racism in judicial systems across the country. The comprehensive nature of the federal prosecution sent shockwaves through family courts nationwide as other jurisdictions faced scrutiny for similar patterns of racial bias. Civil rights organizations used Nadia Okafor's investigation as a model for identifying and challenging systematic discrimination in judicial proceedings. Federal oversight agencies began reviewing family court statistics in every state to identify jurisdictions with suspiciously high rates of custody removals from black families. Nadia Okafor stood before the assembled media outside the federal courthouse, her orange blazer bright in the afternoon sunlight, as she addressed the significance of this prosecution. The systematic violation of civil rights under the guise of child protection represents one of the most insidious forms of institutional racism we have encountered. These defendants used their positions of trust to destroy families and profit from that destruction. Today marks the beginning of accountability and reform that will protect all families regardless of race or economic status. The state attorney general's words carried weight beyond this single prosecution as she outlined plans for ongoing monitoring of family courts statewide. Her office would establish specialized units focused on civil rights violations in judicial settings and create accessible reporting mechanisms for families experiencing bias or discrimination. The courage she had shown during her undercover investigation inspired other attorneys general to examine their own jurisdictions for similar corruption. As the defendants faced their federal sentences, the affected families began rebuilding their lives with the support of substantial settlements and comprehensive services. Children returned to their loving homes, while the adults who had traumatized them faced years in federal prison. The community healing process would take time, but the foundation for justice and equality had been established through Nadia Okafor's extraordinary sacrifice and determination. The bright federal courthouse would forever represent a turning point in the fight against systematic racism in America's judicial system. What began as anonymous complaints from desperate mothers had transformed into a comprehensive reform movement that would protect countless families from similar persecution. Justice had been delivered with the full weight of federal law, ensuring that the corruption network's reign of terror was permanently ended. 6 months after the corruption network's dramatic collapse, the morning sun streamed through the renovated courthouse windows, casting bright natural light across polished marble floors that had witnessed both injustice and redemption. State Attorney General Nadia Okafor stood in the main hallway, wearing her signature orange blazer and navy blue pants, overseeing the final installation of mandatory recording equipment that would ensure every word spoken in these courtrooms would be preserved for posterity. The overhead fluorescent lights illuminated technicians mounting cameras and audio systems, creating a transparency that Judge Edmund Prescott and his corrupt network had fought desperately to avoid. The transformation extended far beyond technology. Every corner of the building reflected the comprehensive reforms that had emerged from Nadia's undercover investigation. New training protocols required all court personnel to complete extensive bias recognition courses, while mandatory supervision ensured that the systematic racism that had destroyed so many black families could never again take root in these halls of justice. Judge Roberta Nakashima approached from the main courtroom, her professional demeanor radiating the integrity that had made her the natural choice to head the new Family Court Oversight Committee. Her presence represented everything the previous system had lacked: fairness, accountability, and genuine commitment to equal justice, regardless of race or economic status. Attorney General Okafor, the morning briefing is ready, Judge Nakashima announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent months rebuilding trust in the judicial system. We have 17 new cases scheduled for review, and every one will be conducted under the new protocols you established. Nadia nodded with satisfaction, remembering the fear and helplessness she had felt sitting in this same courthouse 6 months earlier, subjected to Judge Edmund Prescott's racist tirades while maintaining her undercover cover. The memory of his contemptuous voice calling her ghetto trash seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by the sound of families celebrating reunification and the quiet dignity of fair hearings conducted under bright lights with full documentation. FBI agent Isaiah Carrington emerged from the newly established Civil Rights Court Monitoring Unit office, his muscular frame filling the doorway as he reviewed case files that represented the ongoing mission to prevent judicial corruption. His green shirt and blue jacket marked him as the leader of a federal task force that had grown from their initial investigation into a national model for combating systematic racism in family courts. "The weekly statistics are encouraging," Isaiah reported, his deep voice echoing through the renovated hallway. "Complaint investigations are down 60%, but that's because families now trust the system to operate fairly from the beginning. When people believe they'll receive justice, they don't need to file complaints about bias and corruption." The Civil Rights Court Monitoring Unit had become Isaiah's life work, expanding from their initial focus on family courts to investigating judicial bias across all levels of the legal system. His office walls displayed maps marking corruption investigations in 12 states, each one inspired by the precedent they had established here in what had once been Judge Edmund Prescott's domain. Dr. Lydia Anderson arrived carrying thick binders containing the new psychological evaluation protocols that had revolutionized custody assessments throughout the state. Her research had exposed the fraudulent methods used by Dr. Harold Brennan and others in the corrupt network, replacing biased subjective judgments with evidence-based evaluations that focused on actual parenting capability rather than racial assumptions or economic status. The standardized evaluation process is working exactly as designed, Dr. Anderson explained, opening her binders to reveal comprehensive guidelines that eliminated the discretionary judgment calls that had allowed systematic racism to flourish. Every evaluator now follows identical procedures, and every assessment undergoes peer review before submission to the court. The racial disparities in custody recommendations have virtually disappeared. Her work had extended beyond individual cases to training programs that were being implemented in family courts nationwide. Universities across the country now taught Dr. Anderson's methods as the gold standard for eliminating bias in psychological custody evaluations, ensuring that future generations of mental health professionals would never repeat the systematic discrimination that had characterized the previous system. Attorney Constance Diallo walked through the courthouse entrance, her red dress bright against the morning sunlight that filled the lobby area. The legal aid clinic she had established occupied an entire wing of the courthouse, providing proper representation for every family facing custody disputes, regardless of their ability to pay attorney fees. The contrast with the previous system, where lack of legal representation had made families vulnerable to judicial corruption, could not have been more dramatic. "We processed 43 new cases this week," Constance reported with pride, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had transformed idealistic goals into practical reality. "Every single family received comprehensive legal representation, and our success rate in achieving fair outcomes continues to exceed 90%. When families have proper advocacy, they can stand up to any bias or corruption they encounter." The legal aid clinic had become a model for public defender services, with attorneys from around the country visiting to study their methods and implement similar programs in their own jurisdictions. Constance's work proved that access to quality legal representation was the foundation of equal justice, and her clinic ensured that economic status would never again determine custody outcomes. Reverend Monroe Haynes entered the courthouse wearing his blue jacket, his presence representing the community healing that had become an essential component of the reformed system. The support groups he had created for families affected by the previous corruption had evolved into a comprehensive network, providing counseling, advocacy, and practical assistance for parents navigating the family court system. "The community celebration planning is complete," Reverend Haynes announced, his warm voice carrying the spiritual authority that had made him a natural leader in the healing process. 300 families will gather this afternoon to honor your courage, Attorney General Okafor, and to celebrate the systematic changes that have restored justice to our courthouse. His support groups had documented the experiences of every family that had suffered under Judge Edmund Prescott's corrupt regime, creating a comprehensive record of systematic racism that served as both historical documentation and motivation for continued vigilance against judicial bias. The healing process had strengthened community bonds while ensuring that the lessons learned from this corruption would never be forgotten. Reporter Claudette Simmons approached carrying camera equipment and interview materials, her investigative work having expanded from local courthouse corruption to a national examination of racial bias in family court systems. Her initial coverage of the protests and arrests had evolved into a comprehensive documentary series that was inspiring similar investigations across the country. The national conference coverage will air tonight, Claudette informed the group, her professional demeanor reflecting the serious responsibility of documenting systematic reform. 12 states have launched their own investigations based on your model, and federal legislation is being proposed to mandate the recording equipment and oversight protocols you established here. Her journalism had transformed from local news reporting to a national platform examining judicial corruption and racial bias throughout the American legal system. The story that began with one corrupt judge had become a catalyst for examining systematic problems that affected thousands of families nationwide. The afternoon community celebration filled the courthouse plaza with families whose lives had been transformed by the systematic reforms. Children played under the bright afternoon sun while their parents shared stories of custody battles that had ended fairly, legal representation that had been competent and caring, and psychological evaluations that had focused on actual parenting skills rather than racial stereotypes. Nadia stood at the podium facing hundreds of community members, many of whom had suffered under the previous corrupt system but now served as living testimony to the power of systematic reform. The overhead lighting illuminated faces filled with hope and satisfaction, a dramatic contrast to the fear and helplessness that had characterized family court proceedings under Judge Edmund Prescott's regime. 6 months ago, this courthouse represented everything wrong with our justice system. Nadia addressed the crowd, her voice carrying across the plaza with authority and compassion. Systematic racism, financial corruption, and judicial bias had turned what should have been fair hearings into predetermined outcomes that destroyed black families for profit. But your courage in speaking truth to power, combined with comprehensive investigation and reform, has transformed this courthouse into a model of equal justice. The crowd's response reflected not just appreciation for her individual sacrifice during the undercover operation, but recognition that systematic change required sustained community effort and vigilance. Every person present understood that the reforms they were celebrating represented ongoing work rather than final victory. Judge Edmund Prescott sits in federal prison today, serving his sentence for civil rights violations and corruption. Nadia continued, her words met with satisfied approval from families who had suffered under his racist judgments. But our success cannot be measured by his punishment alone. Our real victory lies in the systematic changes that ensure no other judge can repeat his crimes, no other families will suffer the injustices you experienced, and no other children will be separated from loving parents because of racial bias and financial corruption. The final scene of the community celebration showed families reunited through the reformed system. Legal aid attorneys providing competent representation to parents who previously faced court proceedings alone, and oversight committee members ensuring that every hearing met the highest standards of fairness and transparency. That evening, Nadia stood before a national conference of attorneys general, federal prosecutors, and civil rights investigators, her orange blazer and blue pants professional under the bright conference hall lighting. The audience represented law enforcement officials from every state, each seeking to understand how the systematic corruption had operated and how the comprehensive reforms could be replicated in their own jurisdictions. The undercover investigation that exposed Judge Edmund Prescott's corruption network began with anonymous complaints from black mothers who knew their children were being taken unjustly but lacked the power to challenge systematic racism. Nadia explained to the national audience, "What we discovered was not isolated judicial misconduct, but a comprehensive conspiracy involving judges, police officers, court personnel, and private agencies that profited from separating black families." Her presentation detailed every aspect of the corruption network, from the kickbacks that motivated false arrests to the fraudulent psychological evaluations that provided legal justification for biased custody decisions. The systematic nature of the racism they had uncovered demonstrated that individual misconduct was less dangerous than institutional bias that operated through seemingly legitimate legal procedures. The reforms we implemented address every level of the systematic corruption, Nadia continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had experienced the system from both perspectives as victim and prosecutor. Mandatory recording equipment prevents secret bias. Oversight committees provide ongoing accountability. Standardized evaluation protocols eliminate discriminatory assessments. And legal aid clinics ensure proper representation for all families regardless of economic status. The national audience recognized that the methods developed through their investigation could be applied to rooting out systematic racism in courts throughout the country. Federal legislation, incorporating their oversight protocols, was already advancing through Congress, while individual states were implementing recording requirements and bias training programs based on their model. My sacrifice during the undercover operation was temporary, Nadia concluded, her words inspiring sustained applause from law enforcement officials who understood the personal risk she had accepted to expose systematic corruption. But the systematic reforms we achieved will protect families permanently. When we combine individual courage with comprehensive investigation and community support, we can transform institutions that have operated through bias and corruption for decades. The conference marked not an ending, but a beginning, as attorneys general from 12 states announced new investigations into judicial bias, while federal officials committed resources to supporting similar undercover operations where systematic racism was suspected. The model they had established was being replicated nationwide, ensuring that Judge Edmund Prescott's corruption would ultimately result in justice improvements that extended far beyond their local courthouse. Standing ovation from the national conference reflected recognition that one person's willingness to sacrifice temporarily for systematic change had created permanent improvements in how the American justice system served all families equally, regardless of race or economic status. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.